When Ryan asked me to help Lucy with a project in his family's old house while he was away for the weekend, I thought nothing of it. He'd always trusted me with things like this. I was, after all, his best friend. What I didn't expect was how my time with Lucy would go from a favor to an unspoken connection that neither of us dared to acknowledge or deny. We met outside the house on Saturday morning, the air crisp with the early hints of autumn. Lucy stood there, arms crossed against the chilly breeze, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders. She offered a quick smile as I pulled up, her cheeks flushed with the cold. I could already feel something unexplainable settling in the space between us, something unspoken and magnetic. "Hey, thanks for helping out. I know it's probably the last thing you wanted to spend your weekend doing," she said with a slight laugh, glancing down. "Not at all," I replied, smiling. "Besides, I promised Ryan I'd help, and honestly, I'm curious to see what's hidden in this old attic." She chuckled, rolling her eyes. "You'd be surprised. Ryan's family keeps all sorts of odd things up there. Apparently it's been untouched for years." We grabbed a few things from the car and headed inside, the old house groaning as the door creaked open. The interior smelled of cedar and old wood, the faint scent of memories lingering in the air. Lucy led the way up the winding staircase, and I followed, watching the light trace the lines of her figure as she moved. When we finally reached the attic, Lucy pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit, cluttered space filled with dust-covered boxes, antiques, and forgotten furniture. She slipped inside, holding the door for me, and for a moment, as we stepped into the dusty shadows, it felt like we were leaving the outside world behind. "Let's get started," she said, brushing her hands together as she glanced around the room. We began sorting through boxes, pulling out old family photos, books, and ornaments wrapped in newspaper. Every so often our hands would touch as we worked in close quarters, and each time, it felt as though the air grew thicker. Hours passed as we sifted through memories, occasionally stopping to laugh at a particularly strange relic or to share stories about our lives. She told me about her childhood, her dreams, and the many plans she and Ryan had discussed. But with each word, each quiet smile she offered me, I felt myself being drawn in, mesmerized by the subtle way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, or the way she brushed her hair back absent-mindedly. At one point, while trying to lift a heavy trunk, I lost my balance, and she reached out, catching my arm. Her fingers lingered there for a moment longer than necessary, her gaze meeting mine. The small space between us felt like a line we'd both crossed without realizing it. "Sorry," she whispered, letting go, but there was a softness in her eyes, a vulnerability that matched the way I felt. "It's fine," I replied, voice barely audible. I tried to focus on anything else, but the warmth of her hand on my arm lingered, impossible to ignore. As the sun began to set outside, casting golden light through the attic windows, we sat down on an old sofa we'd uncovered, taking a break from the work. The silence was comfortable, yet heavy with anticipation. "Thanks for being here today," she said softly, her voice breaking the quiet. "Of course. I'd do anything for you," I answered before I could think, the words spilling out in a moment of honesty. Her eyes widened slightly, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. She looked away, fidgeting with her hands before finally meeting my gaze. It's nice to feel this close to someone. Sometimes I wonder if," she stopped herself, shaking her head as if brushing away the thought. "If what?" I asked, my heart pounding. She hesitated, then gave a small, sad smile. "Sometimes I wonder if anyone really understands me." Her words hung in the air, carrying more weight than she likely intended. I wanted to say something to comfort her, to let her know that I understood, that I'd been feeling the same way, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I reached out, gently placing my hand over hers. She didn't pull away. In fact, her fingers curled around mine, and for the first time it felt like we weren't alone in this silent, unspoken connection. As the light faded into a soft glow around us, we sat there, hand in hand, letting the weight of our emotions settle between us. We stayed like that, barely moving, letting the quietness of the attic wrap around us. The sun had fully dipped below the horizon, casting the room in shadows that felt almost protective, as if this old, forgotten space were holding our secrets. Lucy glanced at our intertwined hands, and then slowly raised her gaze to meet mine, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I don't know why this feels so different," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt the same strange pull, a current running between us that was impossible to resist. The urge to close the small distance between us, to let go of any hesitation, grew stronger. But even as I leaned in just slightly, I held back, fighting against the instinct, knowing the boundaries we were crossing. "Lucy," I said softly, trying to find the right words. "We both know this probably isn't a good idea." She nodded, her hand still in mine, her fingers tracing gentle lines along my knuckles. "You're right. she replied, though her voice wavered, betraying a desire that mirrored my own. We sat there in silence, each of us feeling the weight of what we were doing, yet neither of us moved to pull away. Instead, she leaned into me, resting her head on my shoulder, and for a moment, it felt like everything around us disappeared. I could feel her heartbeat through the thin fabric of her shirt, and I could hear the soft hitch in her breath as she settled against me. "I wish things were different," she whispered, her words tinged with longing. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of her touch seep into me, the scent of her hair filling my senses. "Me too," I replied, the words heavy with the realization of what couldn't be. But even as I said it, I knew that leaving things as they were was becoming impossible. Her hand moved from mine, slipping up to rest on my chest, fingers splayed out, feeling the rapid beat of my heart. I felt a pang of guilt twist in my stomach, but it was overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment, the way she looked at me, her eyes dark and searching, as if daring me to take that final step. Without thinking, I leaned in, brushing my lips softly against her forehead, a tentative kiss that held all the emotions we'd been keeping at bay. She didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her head up to meet my gaze, her expression a mix of vulnerability and anticipation. I couldn't stop myself anymore. My hand moved to her cheek, my thumb tracing a line just below her eye, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath my touch. Slowly, I leaned in, closing the space between us until my lips met hers. The kiss was gentle at first, a soft exploration, but it quickly deepened, all the tension and longing we'd been holding back, pouring into that one moment. Her hand slipped around my neck, pulling me closer, and I felt myself get lost in the softness of her touch, the way she melted into me. It was as if every boundary, every line we'd been afraid to cross, faded away. All that mattered was this, the way we fit together, the way we seemed to fill each other's empty spaces. The quiet attic felt like our own world, a place where no one else existed. We held each other close, our breaths mingling as we took our time, savoring every second. But even as the kiss grew more intense, there was a lingering sense of fragility, of knowing that this couldn't last. When we finally pulled away, both of us breathing heavily, reality came crashing back. Her fingers lingered on my collar, her gaze fixed on mine, filled with a mix of awe and confusion. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Neither do I replied, swallowing hard, my heart still racing. "I just know that whatever this is, it feels real." She looked down, biting her lip, and I could see the inner conflict flickering in her eyes. "I know it's wrong. I know we shouldn't, but—" She trailed off, searching for words that didn't come. I gently lifted her chin, making her look at me again. "Lucy, maybe we don't have all the answers right now. Maybe we just need to take this moment as it is, even if it's complicated." Her eyes softened, and she nodded slowly, her fingers lacing with mine. For the first time in a long time, it felt like I'd found someone who understood, someone who saw me in a way that no one else had. And as we sat there in the quiet, with nothing but the sound of our breaths filling the room, I knew that whatever happened next, this moment would stay with me forever. The attic had taken on a different aura, no longer just a dusty room filled with forgotten relics. It felt like a sacred place, a cocoon that held our shared secret. We sat in silence for a while, letting the weight of our actions settle. Every stolen glance, every brush of her fingers against mine felt intensified, deepened by the knowledge that we'd crossed a line neither of us had expected. Lucy leaned her head against my shoulder again, her fingers tracing slow circles along my arm. There was a comforting rhythm to her touch, something that felt both grounding and electric. Her presence, so close, seemed to calm the racing thoughts in my mind. But with each passing moment, the reality of what we'd done crept in, mingling with the lingering warmth of our kiss. After a few minutes, she broke the silence, her voice soft and uncertain. Do you think Ryan suspects anything?" She bit her lip, as if regretting the question as soon as she'd asked it. I shook my head, feeling a pang of guilt at the mention of his name. "No," I replied, my voice barely audible. "He trusts us. He trusts me." The words were difficult to say, the weight of them heavy in my chest. She sighed, nestling closer, as if seeking comfort in my presence despite the conflict it brought. "I don't want to hurt him. I love him. But with you, I feel something I can't explain. It's like I'm finally allowed to be all of myself." I didn't know what to say, and I realized that part of me felt the same. Being with Lucy felt natural in a way that I hadn't anticipated, like a missing piece sliding into place. Yet, the reality of our situation was undeniable. "I feel it too," I whispered, gently brushing my thumb over the back of her hand. "But maybe we need to take a step back. Think about what this means, what we're risking." She nodded, though her gaze remained fixed on our intertwined hands. The thought of pulling away from her felt unbearable, but I knew it was the right thing to do. At least that's what I told myself. "Maybe you're right," she murmured, her voice laced with a bittersweet acceptance. She pulled her hand from mine, and the absence of her touch was like a sudden chill in the air. She stood up slowly, casting a wistful glance back at me before turning toward the attic door. But as she reached for the handle, she stopped, her shoulders tense. She hesitated, then turned back to face me, her eyes filled with a mix of longing and vulnerability. This doesn't feel like it's over," she whispered, her words barely audible. I swallowed, nodding as I stood up, closing the distance between us. "I don't think it is," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "But maybe we need time to figure out what to do, how to handle this without causing any more pain." Her eyes searched mine, as if trying to find clarity in the storm of emotions that churned between us. And though no words passed between us, I could feel the quiet understanding, the unspoken promise that this wasn't goodbye, it was merely a pause, a space for us to breathe. We stood there for a long moment, letting the silence say what we couldn't. And then, reluctantly, she turned and left the attic, leaving me alone with the memory of our shared moments, the warmth of her touch still lingering in the air. As I watched her disappear down the staircase, I felt the weight of what we'd done settle deep within me. A part of me wanted to chase after her, to pull her close and lose myself in the comfort of her presence once more. But another part, the one grounded in reality, knew that this pause was necessary. We needed time, space to sort through the whirlwind of emotions, to understand what we truly wanted. Yet, even as I stood there alone, surrounded by the remnants of the past, I knew that no matter how much time passed, this connection between us wasn't something I could simply walk away from. Days passed, and though we'd agreed to take a step back, I couldn't escape the constant pull toward Lucy. The moments we'd shared in the attic lingered in my mind, replaying like a song stuck on repeat. Every glance, every touch, the way her lips had felt against mine, they haunted me, tempting me to reach out, to find some way to keep her close. Ryan returned that weekend, and we all fell back into the familiar routines. But the dynamic had shifted. When Lucy and I were in the same room, an unspoken tension hovered between us, like a current just beneath the surface. I found myself hyper-aware of her every move, each time her gaze met mine, each accidental brush of our hands when we passed each other. It was maddening, feeling so close to her, yet restrained by the boundaries we'd imposed on ourselves. One night, about a week after the attic, Ryan invited me over to watch a game with him. I agreed, though I knew it would be torture being near her, pretending that nothing had changed. When I arrived, Lucy was already there, setting out snacks and making herself busy in the kitchen. I could feel her presence even before I saw her, an invisible tether drawing me in. As the game wore on, I tried to focus, but my thoughts kept drifting to her. She sat across the room, and though she seemed engaged in conversation with Ryan, every so often, our eyes would meet, holding just a moment too long before we looked away. Each glance was like a reminder of everything we couldn't say, everything we'd felt in that quiet attic. At halftime, Ryan got up to grab more drinks, leaving Lucy and me alone for the first time that night. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable, and I felt my pulse quicken. The weight of our silence was thick, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice soft, almost hesitant. She nodded, though her gaze flickered with a hint of sadness. "I'm managing," she replied, her words carrying a weight that only I could understand. She paused, her eyes searching mine, as if debating whether to say more. This is harder than I thought it would be." I swallowed, the ache of longing settling deep within me. "It's hard for me too," I admitted. "Every time I see you, my words trailed off, caught between honesty and restraint." She gave a faint, almost bittersweet smile. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too." Ryan returned before we could say more, and we both fell silent, masking our emotions with forced smiles and easy conversation. But the night only intensified the tension between us, each shared glance, each accidental touch, only deepening the connection we'd been trying to ignore. When I finally left, the air between us felt heavy, laden with unspoken words. I wanted to reach out, to say something, to somehow bridge the gap that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. But instead I walked away, feeling the weight of our unresolved emotions pressing down on me. The days that followed were a blur of restless nights and wandering thoughts. I tried to busy myself to focus on anything other than Lucy, but it was no use. She was always there, lingering in the back of my mind, her voice, her touch, her laugh haunting my every waking moment. And then one evening I received a message from her, Just a simple line, but it was enough to send my heart racing. "Can we talk? Just us?" I hesitated, my mind torn between anticipation and caution. But in the end, I knew that whatever this was, it needed resolution, even if it led us somewhere we couldn't return from. We met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, a place where no one would recognize us, a place that felt safe for our fragile secrets. She was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner table, her eyes distant, lost in thought. I took a seat across from her, and for a moment we just looked at each other, words unnecessary, the intensity of our connection filling the silence. "I can't keep going like this," she finally said, her voice trembling, pretending everything is fine when it's not. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Neither can I. This thing between us, it feels impossible, but I can't ignore it. She took a deep breath, her hands twisting nervously. "I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm living two lives, one with Ryan and one with you." Her words hit me hard, and I felt a pang of guilt, but also a strange relief, knowing that I wasn't alone in this. "Maybe we don't need to have all the answers right now," I said softly. "Maybe we just need to be honest with each other to figure out what this really means for both of us." She nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on mine, and for the first time I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Then let's be honest, no hiding, no pretending." She reached across the table, her hand covering mine, and the warmth of her touch felt like a balm to the ache I'd been carrying. We sat there, hands entwined, letting the truth settle between us. And though we didn't have a clear path forward, there was comfort in the honesty, in knowing that whatever happened next, we would face it together. As we sat there, the world around us faded, leaving only the fragile connection between us. The noise of the cafe, the clinking of glasses, the hum of voices, all of it dissolved into the background. Her fingers traced gentle patterns over my hand, and in that small gesture I felt both the weight of everything we were risking and the relief of finally being seen. "What are we doing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes held a mix of hope and fear, as if the answer would either heal or shatter her. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice thick with emotion, "but I know that this ... whatever it is between us ... it's real, and I don't want to pretend it isn't." She looked down, a faint, bittersweet smile playing on her lips. "I feel the same, but we're both caught between what we want and what's right." The truth of her words settled over us, heavy and inescapable. We both knew that no matter how strong our connection felt, there were people in our lives, bonds of loyalty and love, that complicated everything. And yet, as we sat in that quiet cafe, it was hard to remember any of the reasons to hold back. Maybe I hesitated, searching for the right words. Maybe we don't have to figure everything out right now. Maybe we can just ... be here, in this moment, and let it be enough. She met my gaze, her eyes soft and vulnerable. Slowly she nodded, her fingers tightening around mine. "I'd like that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. We lingered there, wrapped in the warmth of our shared understanding. For a while it felt like we could have stayed in that bubble of peace, untouched by the outside world. But the ticking of the clock reminded us that eventually we would have to return to reality, to the people waiting for us, to the lives we'd built. When we finally left the cafe, the night air was cool, the streets quiet. We walked side by side, neither of us speaking, our hands occasionally brushing, a silent testament to everything left unsaid. I walked her to her car, and as we stood there under the glow of the streetlight, a quiet resignation settled over us. "This isn't goodbye, is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," I replied, a soft certainty in my words, "but it's ... a pause, a time for us to figure out where this fits into our lives." She looked up at me, her eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and hope. "Then let's make a promise, that we'll be honest with each other no matter what, that we'll follow this wherever it leads, even if it's messy." I nodded, my hand moving to gently cup her cheek, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath my fingers. "I promise." She leaned into my touch, closing her eyes, and for a moment it felt like everything around us had stilled. I brushed a soft kiss over her forehead, a quiet promise that spoke of everything I couldn't put into words. "Take care, Lucy," I murmured, stepping back, feeling the ache of parting, even as I knew it was necessary. "Goodbye," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly, as if leaving something unfinished. She turned and got into her car, the engine purring to life as she glanced back at me one last time. And then she was gone, the taillights disappearing down the quiet street. The days that followed were filled with a strange emptiness. Life continued as usual, work, friends, family, but there was a quiet space in my heart that only Lucy seemed to fill. I went through the motions, smiling and laughing with Ryan, all the while carrying the weight of the promise we'd made, a vow to face the truth, no matter how difficult. One evening a few weeks later, as I was sitting alone in my apartment, my phone lit up with a message. "I miss you. Can we talk?" My heart skipped a beat, a mixture of relief and longing flooding through me. I knew that whatever she wanted to say, I would be there to listen, to meet her wherever she needed me. We met in the same quiet cafe, slipping back into our familiar seats. This time the air was filled not with hesitation but with a quiet resolve. She reached across the table, taking my hand, her eyes meeting mine with a calm certainty. "I can't keep living like this," she said softly, her voice steady. "This feeling, this connection, it's too real to ignore. But I also know it's unfair to everyone involved if we keep pretending it's not happening." I nodded, the weight of her words settling over me. "So what do we do?" She took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. "We tell the truth. To Ryan, to ourselves. It's the only way forward, even if it hurts." Her words filled me with both fear and a strange sense of peace. I knew that the path ahead would be difficult, filled with conversations that would undoubtedly lead to pain. But I also knew that I couldn't keep lying, not to Ryan, not to Lucy, and not to myself. We sat there, hand in hand, letting the weight of our decision settle between us. And in that moment I realized that sometimes love meant making choices that were hard, that hurt, but that ultimately led to something true, something real. As we left the cafe, I felt a sense of clarity, a quiet resolve that I hadn't felt before. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew that whatever happened, we would face it honestly, with the same openness that had brought us together in the first place. And as we parted that night, I felt the quiet promise of something lasting, a love built on truth, no matter how complicated.